Charlotte Curtis, associate editor of the New York Times and editor of the op-ed page, was in Columbus to speak to the International Council of Mid-Ohio. Her speech was on the United States foreign policy in an election year, and I asked her if indeed there is a distinct difference between U.S. foreign policy in an election year and that of other years.
Oh, I think so. Every election year, starting really in 1948, we have a tendency all of a sudden to talk about some kind of arms gap or defense. This has been typical of elections. Remember Jack Kennedy in 1960 and the missile gap? Well, along comes the whole question now of who has arms superiority, the Russians or the Americans, and then how much we should spend on American arms. It's out of all proportion to what we should be talking about. As a result, we don't talk about real foreign policy questions, which is how to deal with Africa, how to deal with the Soviet Union. We have, in a way, made a defense policy and defense arguments over amounts of arms a substitute for a discussion of foreign policy.
Ronald Reagan is favoring scrapping SALT II and beginning on a new SALT III treaty. Should we do that, or should we stick with the SALT II treaty?
Let's talk about SALT. SALT II took 7 years to negotiate. This was the kind of agonizing, patient, over-the-table, midnight meetings, smoke-filled rooms even. 7 years to put this together. Finally, we could get the Americans to agree and the Soviets to agree. If you are talking about scrapping this treaty, and I'm not sure this treaty isn't dead already, and instituting a new treaty, as Ronald Reagan suggests with SALT III, I would say the following. First, the Russians are not going to spend another 7 or 10 years or whatever it takes to put together a new treaty. They have counted on this treaty. They have counted on this treaty so that they don't have to have an arms race in the same way that many Americans count on it so that we don't have to have an arms race. I think when they went through all that process and then Mr. Carter could not get it through Congress and Congress wouldn't give it to him, they are certainly not going to go through another process which would lead to a treaty that would be even harder on them, that would work to their disadvantage from their point of view. I think we need SALT II. I think it is fundamental to foreign affairs, unless you are interested in an arms race. And to divert lots of American funds to an arms race not only increases inflation, which is one of the banes of our existence at this time, but it also takes our mind off the kinds of things we should be doing in direct diplomatic negotiations with countries.
Let's just ask the viewers at home what they think about SALT II. Would you favor a new strategic arms limitation treaty, that is, eliminating the SALT II treaty and beginning on a SALT III treaty? If you would, touch button number 1, and if not, button 2, and touch when you see the sign. Will the new Soviet Premier Nikolai Tikhonov change the relationship that the United States has with the Soviet Union?
No, I don't think so. You know, we tend to think of the aging Russian leaders as interchangeable, and to a certain extent they are. But in this particular case, Mr. Kosygin has not been well, or if he's been well, he's really not been doing the job. And the man who succeeds him has been doing most of the job. So essentially, we just are formalizing an arrangement that had already existed.
You recently returned from a trip to China. How do the Chinese perceive both President Carter and Ronald Reagan? And who do they seem to be favoring at this point for president?
Well, the Chinese, I think, really had not made up their minds until George Bush came to Peking and explained to the Chinese that the Americans would be more even-handed in a Reagan administration. Well, at the same time, as you know, Ronald Reagan back in this country was saying that he was going to reconnect with Taiwan, which was a terribly unfortunate mistake. Well, that had the Chinese, as you can well imagine, in a fury. I mean, it was the first time the American ambassador had ever had to make a major statement in Peking assuring the Chinese that this was not the case. So as a result of that, the Chinese would certainly be more interested in Mr. Carter than Mr. Reagan. But when you say Chinese, what are we talking about? We're talking about the very top level who are involved in foreign affairs. The average Chinese, 1 billion people, don't know who Mr. Carter is, don't know who Mr. Reagan is, and really couldn't care less.
In your book, The Rich and Other Atrocities, Ronald Reagan is mentioned a couple of times. From what you have observed of him over the years, is becoming President of the United States something he has always wanted to do?
I'm not sure that I'm enough of an observer to be able to answer that, but just out of hand. I don't think he always wanted to be president. No, I think it's something that came with the public service role he did as governor of California, and as he watched the country turn in directions that he disapproves of. I think the passion hitting sometime in the 70s. I think we saw it very clearly at the Kansas City Convention in 1976, where there was no question then that he wanted to be president, and was deeply disappointed when President Ford prevailed. But I really don't think he's wanted to be president all his life.
Have you personally had a chance to talk with either Ronald Reagan or President Carter?
Well, both of them. Over the years, I've talked to both of them, and in this campaign, I've talked to both of them. Ronald Reagan is a personable man, dedicated, charming. I just don't think he has the basic knowledge. President Carter is not as charming. He's tougher. I think he has now, with the 4 years in office, some experience that might be valuable. You know, in a way, we're talking about a man who's a governor of a large state who wants the job and really isn't qualified. And 4 years ago, we were talking about the governor of a large state who really wasn't qualified. I must say, I think that the American voters are very unhappy with both candidates.
Have you had a chance to talk with John Anderson?
Yes, bright, personable, intelligent, interesting, well-informed. But isn't that campaign irrelevant? In terms, it isn't that it isn't irrelevant if you want to protest Mr. Carter or Mr. Reagan. But in the end, Americans are going to choose, whether we like it or not, Americans are going to choose between Mr. Carter and Mr. Reagan.
What kind of impact do you think the feminist vote is going to have this election?
Well, you know, I think women like to think that the feminist vote counts for a lot. I think there'll be an impact in the sense that there's a lot of unhappiness with Governor Reagan. But in the end, I wonder how many women actually cross party lines on feminist issues. I mean, the question really should be, are Republican women going to quit voting for Ronald Reagan, or never vote for Ronald Reagan because of feminist issues, or are they going to vote for President Carter for feminist reasons?
Ms. Curtis, let's just ask the women at home a moment. If you were not in favor of a particular candidate's views on women, would you go ahead and vote for that candidate anyway? If you would, touch button number 1, and if not, button 2, and touch when you see the sign. You have said that the reason you're so successful is that your mother wouldn't let you be ordinary. How did she do that?
Well, I think my mother is an exceptional woman. She was graduated from college at some incredible age, 14, 16, but certainly not 18 maybe, but in any event it wasn't 21. She majored in economics at a time when that's not what women did. She worked in France for war relief, and then she joined the United States Foreign Service, the first woman in the Foreign Service. And then she came back and ran her father's hotels, and obviously had 2 children, my sister and me, and was the wife of a physician, coping with these multiple hats simultaneously. That is an extraordinary person. And she didn't like people around her, I think, who weren't making every effort and working very hard. And that, I suppose, the most obvious meaning of being extraordinary because you really weren't allowed to be ordinary.